Bob Mitchell's weathered hand froze on the kennel latch, his coffee-stained adoption form trembling as he read the brass tag hanging from the German Shepherd's collar. The words, Officer Atlas, Badge Number 2847, K9 Bomb Detection Unit, sent ice through his 70-year-old veins. This wasn't just any unwanted dog. The shelter director's clipboard clattered to the concrete floor, her face draining of color as she whispered, "Sweet Jesus, that's the Pittsburgh hero dog." Behind them, 23 rejection forms scattered in the wind like fallen leaves. 23 families who'd walked away from a legend. Bob's mind flashed to the newspaper headlines, the synagogue bombing, the 47 lives saved. His own daughter, Sarah's face, smiled back from his wallet photo, one of those 47. "Call the FBI," the director stammered, reaching for her phone with shaking fingers. Who had thrown away a national hero? And why was this miracle sitting forgotten in Kennel 47 with less than 24 hours to live? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through Millbrook's quiet streets as Bob Mitchell sat on his weathered front porch, staring at the empty rocking chair beside him. 3 years. 3 years since Helen's funeral. 3 years of talking to photographs. 3 years of cooking dinner for two and throwing half away. At 68, his Social Security check of $1,247 barely covered the mortgage payments on a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. His arthritic fingers wrapped around the coffee mug Helen had painted for him in '78. World's Best Cop in fading blue letters. The irony wasn't lost on him. 30 years on the force, and he couldn't even protect his own wife from Alzheimer's. Couldn't afford the treatments that might have bought them more time. Couldn't save the woman who'd saved him from becoming just another bitter old cop drinking himself to death. Bob's daughter Sarah had been calling more frequently lately, her voice tight with concern. "Dad, you need to get out more. Maybe volunteer somewhere. Maybe get a dog." The suggestion always made his chest tighten. He'd had a dog once, Max, his German Shepherd partner from '85 to '87. Best police dog the department ever had until that drug bust went sideways and Max took a bullet meant for Bob. He'd sworn off K9 partnerships after that. Some kinds of love hurt too much to risk twice. The house felt smaller every day. Helen's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter. Her romance novels remained bookmarked on page 237 of Love's Sweet Promise. Bob kept meaning to pack them away, but somehow never found the strength. The silence had weight now, pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. His neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had mentioned the animal shelter during their brief conversation over the fence last week. "They're overflowing with older dogs nobody wants," she'd said, her voice heavy with the particular sadness that came with understanding rejection. Dogs that just need someone to love them. Bob had nodded politely and changed the subject, but her words had lodged themselves in his mind like splinters. Detective Marcus Webb, his old partner, stopped by occasionally with updates from the precinct and stories Bob pretended to care about. Webb had retired the same year Bob did, but his pension was better, his kids visited more, his wife was still alive. The contrast was painful, though Webb was kind enough never to mention it directly. The VFW Hall offered some companionship on Wednesday nights, but the other veterans were either dying or dead, and their war stories had grown stale with repetition. Frank Kowalski, his closest friend there, had been pushing him to find something to live for besides memories. Easy for Frank to say. His grandchildren visited every Sunday. This morning, something had broken inside Bob's chest when he'd found himself setting 2 plates for breakfast again. The empty chair across from him had seemed to mock his solitude. Maybe it was time to stop running from the possibility of caring about something again. The Millbrook County Animal Shelter smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a combination that hit Bob like a physical blow as he pushed through the glass doors. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of kennels where dozens of dogs waited behind chain-link gates. The cacophony of barking, whining, and scratching created a symphony of abandonment that made his chest tighten. "Can I help you?" A young woman with tired eyes and coffee stains on her uniform approached him. Her name tag read Jessica, and she carried herself with the weary patience of someone who'd seen too many broken promises. "I'm looking to adopt," Bob said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Something older, maybe. Quiet." Jessica's face brightened with surprised hope. "Most people want puppies. We have several senior dogs that would make wonderful companions." She gestured toward the back of the facility. "Fair warning, though. Some of them have been here a while." People can be particular. They walked past kennel after kennel. A graying golden retriever pressed his nose through the fence, tail wagging hopefully. A one-eyed beagle sat perfectly still, watching Bob with the dignity of a creature who'd learned not to expect much. But it was Kennel 47 that stopped Bob in his tracks. The German Shepherd inside wasn't moving. He sat with his back to the walkway, shoulders hunched, head down. His coat was the rich black and tan Bob remembered from his K9 days, but this dog carried himself like a soldier who'd lost his war. A jagged scar ran across his left cheek, and his left eye held the cloudy haze of old injury. "That's Atlas," Jessica said quietly, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He's been here 29 days. Tomorrow." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Bob crouched slowly, his knees protesting. "Hey there, boy." Atlas didn't turn around. "What's his story?" Jessica pulled out a clipboard thick with rejection forms. 23 families have passed on him. He's 6 years old, which people think is too old. The scars make him look aggressive. He won't play with toys, won't show enthusiasm during meet and greets. People want dogs that make them feel good about themselves. Bob studied the motionless figure. Something about the dog's posture reminded him of veterans he'd known. Men who'd seen too much, lost too much, and had stopped expecting the world to make sense. "Can I go in?" "I don't recommend—" "I was a cop for 30 years. I know dogs." Jessica hesitated, then unlocked the gate. Bob stepped inside, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. Atlas still didn't turn around, but his ears flicked back slightly, acknowledgement without commitment. Bob settled onto the concrete floor, his back against the kennel wall. "You know what, boy? Sometimes sitting quiet is the smartest thing you can do." He pulled out his wallet, found the photo of Helen from their wedding day. "This was my wife, Helen. Prettiest girl in 3 counties. And somehow she agreed to marry an old fool like me." For the first time, Atlas turned his head slightly, not toward Bob, but enough to show he was listening. "Lost her 3 years ago. Cancer." The lie came easier now, worn smooth by repetition. The truth, that Helen was alive but lost to Alzheimer's in a memory care facility he could no longer afford, was too complicated, too shameful. "Some days I sit on my porch and think about joining her, but then I remember she used to say that giving up was just another word for quitting, and she didn't raise no quitters." Atlas turned fully now, fixing Bob with his good eye. The brown iris held depths of intelligence and pain that made Bob's breath catch. "Jesus," he whispered, reaching slowly toward the dog's collar. "What does this say?" The brass tag was tarnished but readable. "Officer Atlas, badge number 2847, K9 Bomb Detection Unit, Pittsburgh PD. If found, contact Detective Sarah Chen." The world tilted. Bob's vision blurred as memories crashed over him. Newspaper headlines about the synagogue bombing, the hero dog who detected explosives, saved 47 lives. His own daughter Sarah had been one of the responding officers that day. "You're him," Bob breathed. "You're the Pittsburgh hero." Atlas lowered his head to his paws, as if the weight of his former glory was too much to bear. Bob's hands shook as he stood, his mind racing. This wasn't just any abandoned dog. This was a living legend, a creature who'd risked everything to save innocent lives, and somehow he'd ended up here, forgotten and scheduled for execution. "Jessica," Bob called out, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't used in years. "I need to make a phone call, and I need adoption papers. Now." For the first time in 29 days, Atlas lifted his head and looked directly at Bob Mitchell, and something passed between them. An understanding that transcended words, species, and the accumulated weight of their shared loneliness. Bob's hands trembled as he dialed the Pittsburgh Police Department from the shelter's cramped office. The receiver felt slick against his palm while Jessica hovered nearby, clutching the adoption paperwork like a lifeline. Through the window, he could see Atlas still sitting motionless in Kennel 47, as if he'd accepted his fate long ago. "Pittsburgh PD, how can I help you?" "I need to speak with Detective Sarah Chen. It's about Officer Atlas." A long pause. "Sir, Detective Chen died in the line of duty 3 years ago. Can someone else help you?" The words hit Bob like a physical blow. Sarah Chen, dead. The handler who'd loved Atlas enough to risk her life with him. No wonder the dog had given up hope. "I'm sorry, I found her canine partner at an animal shelter. He's scheduled to be put down tomorrow." "Hold, please." Bob paced the small office, watching the clock tick toward 5 p.m., closing time. Each second brought Atlas closer to his final appointment. Jessica busied herself preparing the adoption forms, but her eyes kept darting to Bob's face, reading the growing desperation there. "This is Captain Rodriguez. You said you found Atlas?" "Yes, sir. Millbrook County Animal Shelter in Pennsylvania. He's been here 29 days. Nobody wanted him." A heavy sigh traveled through the phone line. "Atlas went missing after Detective Chen's funeral. We searched for weeks. The dog just vanished. We assumed he'd died." "Well, he's alive and he needs help. What happened to him?" Another pause, longer this time. "Son, that dog saved 47 lives in the Squirrel Hill synagogue bombing. When that lunatic planted those devices, Atlas found every single one. The last bomb, Detective Chen was disarming it when the secondary device went off. Atlas tried to shield her, took shrapnel to the face and eye. Chen didn't make it, but Atlas survived. Physically, anyway." Bob's throat tightened. "So he's been traumatized." "PTSD. In dogs, we call it canine PTSD, but yeah, Atlas wouldn't work after that. Wouldn't eat much, wouldn't interact with other handlers. The department tried everything. Therapy, medication, different partners. Nothing worked. He just shut down." Through the office window, Bob watched Atlas shift slightly, and for a moment their eyes met. The dog's expression held such profound sadness that Bob had to look away. "What are his adoption requirements?" "There aren't any, officially. The department wrote him off as deceased. But, sir, I have to warn you, Atlas isn't a pet. He's a working dog who can't work anymore. He's been trained to detect explosives, to take down armed suspects. In the wrong hands." "I'm not the wrong hands," Bob interrupted, his voice carrying 30 years of police authority. "Officer Robert Mitchell, Millbrook PD, retired. 30 years on the force, 15 with K9 units." The captain's tone shifted, became more respectful. "Then you understand what you're getting into. Atlas is broken, Officer Mitchell. He may never be the same." "Neither am I," Bob said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly what we both need." After hanging up, Bob stared at the adoption forms. The fee was $500, money he didn't have. His bank account held exactly $247, and his next Social Security check wasn't due for 2 weeks. He thought about his service watch, the gold Omega Helen had given him for his 25th anniversary on the force. It was the last valuable thing he owned. "Jessica, I need to step out for an hour. Can you hold Atlas until I get back?" "Sir, we close at 5. Please." The word came out rougher than he intended. "That dog is a war hero. He saved my daughter's life in Pittsburgh. I just need time to get the money." Jessica looked at the clock, then at the desperation in Bob's eyes. "I'll stay late." "But if you're not back by 6... Bob was already moving toward the door. 20 minutes later, he stood in Kowalski's pawn shop, his service watch on the counter between him and Frank's younger brother Eddie. The shop smelled of desperation and broken dreams, filled with wedding rings, guitars, and power tools that once meant something to someone. "It's a nice piece, Mr. Mitchell, but the market's soft right now. Best I can do is 300. Bob's jaw tightened. The watch was worth twice that, but pawn shops dealt in desperation, not fair value. "I need 500. Eddie shook his head. "Can't do it. 350, final offer." Bob pulled out his wallet, counting the bills. $247 plus 350 was still short. He looked around the shop, his eyes landing on Helen's engagement ring, the one he'd been carrying since the funeral, unable to bear wearing it but unable to put it away. The diamond caught the fluorescent light, throwing tiny rainbows across the glass counter. Helen had worn it for 43 years, through good times and bad, through his dangerous nights and her worried days. She'd never taken it off, not even during the chemo treatments that had stolen her strength but never her spirit. "What about this?" Bob's voice cracked as he placed the ring beside the watch. Eddie examined it through his jeweler's loupe. "Now we're talking. The ring and the watch together, I can do 700. Bob's chest felt like it was caving in. Helen's ring, the symbol of their love, their life together. But then he thought about Atlas, sitting in that kennel, waiting to die. Helen would understand. She'd always loved animals, had begged him to get a dog after he retired. Deal. By 5:45, Bob was back at the shelter, clutching the adoption papers and a receipt showing the $500 fee had been paid. Jessica met him at the door, relief flooding her face. "I was getting worried. Let me get Atlas ready for you." The leash felt familiar in Bob's hands as Jessica led Atlas out of the kennel. The dog walked with mechanical precision, neither eager nor resistant, just compliant. They completed the paperwork in silence, Jessica occasionally glancing at Atlas with the worried expression of someone who'd seen too many returns. "He might not adjust immediately," she warned. "Some dogs take weeks to settle into new homes, and given his background—" "We'll figure it out," Bob said, more to convince himself than her. In the parking lot, Bob opened the passenger door of his 15-year-old Ford pickup. Atlas stood beside the truck, looking up at the open door with no apparent interest. Bob waited, remembering his K-9 training, never force, always invite. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." Atlas stared at him for a long moment, then gracefully leaped into the truck and settled on the worn bench seat. He didn't look out the window or show any curiosity about his surroundings. He simply sat, staring straight ahead, as Bob started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive home was silent except for the truck's engine and the sound of Atlas's steady breathing. Bob found himself glancing over at his passenger every few seconds, still hardly believing that this legendary dog was now his responsibility. The weight of it pressed down on him, $500 he couldn't afford, a traumatized animal he might not be able to help, and the growing certainty that he'd just made either the best or worst decision of his life. The first night was a disaster. Atlas refused to come inside the house, despite Bob's patient coaxing and the October chill that promised an early frost. He stationed himself on the front porch, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the street as if expecting an attack. Bob brought out blankets, food, water. Everything was ignored. When Bob finally gave up and went inside, he watched through the window as Atlas settled into what could only be described as a guard position, alert and ready for threats that existed only in his traumatized mind. Bob slept poorly, waking every hour to check on the dog. Each time, Atlas was in the same position, vigilant, unmoving, a four-legged sentry protecting a house that held nothing but memories and an old man's loneliness. The next morning brought Mrs. Henderson from next door, her face pinched with concern and something darker. "Bob, what is that animal doing on your porch?" "That's Atlas. I adopted him yesterday. He looks dangerous." "Those scars, the way he's watching everything. My granddaughter visits on weekends. I don't feel safe with that thing so close." Bob's jaw tightened. "That thing is a decorated police dog who saved 47 lives. He's not dangerous." But even as he defended Atlas, doubt crept in. The dog hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk water, hadn't acknowledged Bob's presence except to track his movements with those haunted eyes. What if he really couldn't help? What if he'd spent his last $500 on a broken animal he had no business trying to fix? The financial reality hit him full force when he went grocery shopping that afternoon. Dog food cost $42 for a decent bag. Veterinary care would be hundreds more. Atlas clearly needed a thorough examination, vaccinations, and probably treatment for his old injuries. Bob's bank account now held exactly $47, and his next Social Security check was still 10 days away. He bought the cheapest dog food he could find and a package of marked-down ground beef. If they were going to eat, they'd have to share. Atlas accepted the food with mechanical efficiency, eating just enough to survive before returning to his post. No tail wagging, no gratitude, just the basic functions of staying alive. Bob found himself talking to the dog constantly, filling the silence with stories about Helen, about his police work, about anything that might penetrate the wall Atlas had built around himself. "You know, boy, I had a partner once. German Shepherd like you, name of Max, best nose on the force, could find drugs hidden in places you wouldn't believe. He saved my bacon more than once." Bob settled into the porch chair beside Atlas, who didn't acknowledge him but didn't move away either. "Lost him in '87. Drug bust went sideways, and Max took a bullet meant for me. Blamed myself for years." A flicker of something passed through Atlas's eyes, recognition perhaps of shared loss. The third day brought Detective Marcus Webb to Bob's door, his face grim with the particular expression that meant official business. Webb was 5 years younger than Bob, still carrying himself with the authority of active duty despite his recent retirement. They'd been partners for 7 years before Bob moved to K-9 units, and Webb knew him well enough to read the desperation Bob was trying to hide. "Bob, we need to talk about that dog." "What about him?" Webb glanced at Atlas, who had risen to his feet at the approach of a stranger. The dog's posture was alert but not aggressive, a professional assessment of potential threat. "That animal destroyed my son's life." The words hit Bob like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "Jamie was 12 when it happened. We were visiting Pittsburgh, and Jamie wandered off at the police station. Ended up in the K-9 training area where Atlas was working. The dog just snapped. Attacked without warning. Jamie's been in a wheelchair ever since." Bob's world tilted. He looked at Atlas, trying to reconcile the still, vigilant animal with Webb's accusation. "That doesn't sound right, Marcus. K-9s don't just attack children." "You weren't there." Webb's voice cracked with old pain. "You didn't see what I saw. That dog is dangerous, Bob. Unpredictable, And now you're keeping him in a residential neighborhood where kids play. Bob's mind raced, trying to process this information. If Webb was telling the truth, then Atlas was indeed dangerous. But something about the story felt incomplete, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Did you file a report? Webb's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Bob caught it. The department covered it up, said it would hurt Atlas's reputation as a hero dog. They transferred him to bomb detection to keep him away from the public. That night, Bob couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Atlas, studying the dog's profile in the moonlight. The scars told a story of violence and pain, but Bob had spent enough years reading people and animals to sense something deeper. There was intelligence in Atlas's bearing, a careful control that spoke of training and discipline, not random aggression. "What really happened, boy?" Bob whispered. "What aren't you telling me?" Atlas turned his head slightly, acknowledging the question without answering it. The fourth day brought financial crisis. Bob's truck wouldn't start, and the mechanic's estimate was $300, money he simply didn't have. He walked to the grocery store, bought rice and beans with his last $20, and shared the meager meal with Atlas on the porch. The dog ate without enthusiasm, then returned to his vigil. Mrs. Henderson appeared again, this time with backup, 2 other neighbors and a man Bob didn't recognize wearing a suit that screamed official business. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Jim Crawford from Animal Control. We've received multiple complaints about your dog." Bob stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting. "What kind of complaints?" "Aggressive behavior, public safety concerns. I need to see your adoption papers and vaccination records." Bob produced the adoption papers, but the vaccination question hit like a punch to the gut. He hadn't taken Atlas to a vet yet, couldn't afford to. "We have an appointment scheduled," he lied. Crawford examined the papers, then studied Atlas with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of problem animals. "This dog has a history of violence. I'm going to have to issue a citation for harboring a dangerous animal. You have 48 hours to comply with city ordinances, or we'll have to remove him." After they left, Bob slumped in his chair, defeat washing over him. 48 hours to find money he didn't have for veterinary care he couldn't afford for a dog who might actually be dangerous. He thought about Helen's ring, sold for Atlas's adoption fee, and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. That evening, as Bob sat staring at the citation, Atlas did something unexpected. The dog rose from his usual position and walked to Bob's chair, sitting down directly beside him. For the first time since the adoption, Atlas allowed physical contact, leaning slightly against Bob's leg. "You trying to tell me something, boy?" Atlas looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and Bob saw something he'd missed before. Not aggression or unpredictability, but profound sadness. This was a dog who'd lost everything: his handler, his purpose, his identity. And now, he was about to lose the only person who'd shown him kindness in 3 years. The breakthrough came on the 5th day, when Bob was struggling to start his truck with a dead battery. He was late for his appointment at the bank, hoping to negotiate some kind of loan against his house, when he heard a commotion down the street. Mrs. Henderson was screaming, and he could see smoke coming from her backyard. Bob ran as fast as his aging legs would carry him, but Atlas got there first. The dog had somehow gotten into Mrs. Henderson's yard and was barking urgently at her back door. When Bob arrived, he found Mrs. Henderson unconscious on her kitchen floor, a pot of grease burning on the stove. Bob shut off the burner and called 911 while Atlas stayed with Mrs. Henderson, gently nudging her face until she regained consciousness. The paramedics later said that if they'd arrived even 5 minutes later, the smoke inhalation could have been fatal. Mrs. Henderson gripped Bob's hand as they loaded her into the ambulance. "I was wrong about your dog. He saved my life." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, Bob's porch was crowded with neighbors bringing food, offers of help, and apologies. Tom Martinez from down the street was a mechanic. He'd fix Bob's truck for free. Sarah Williams worked at the veterinary clinic. She'd arrange for Atlas's checkup at no charge. Even Jim Crawford from Animal Control returned, sheepishly tearing up the citation. "That dog's a hero," Crawford said simply. "We don't cite heroes." But the biggest surprise came when Webb returned, his face pale and strained. "Bob, I need to tell you something. About Jamie. About what really happened." They sat on the porch, Atlas between them, as Webb's carefully constructed lie began to crumble. Jamie wasn't attacked by Atlas. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time during a drug bust. Got caught in the crossfire when suspects started shooting. I blamed Atlas because it was easier than admitting I'd failed to protect my own son. Bob felt anger and relief in equal measure. "You let me think he was dangerous." "I know, and I'm sorry. But Bob, there's something else. Something about Atlas that you need to know." Webb's voice dropped to a whisper. "The drug bust where Jamie got hurt. Atlas was there working, and the suspects weren't random dealers. They were part of a cartel operation, and Atlas's nose work helped take down their entire network. Those people have long memories, Bob. They've been looking for Atlas for 3 years." The words hung in the evening air like a threat. Bob looked at Atlas, finally understanding the dog's hypervigilance, his refusal to relax his guard. "You think they're still hunting him?" "I know they are." "Bob, adopting this dog might have saved his life, but it might have put yours in danger." As if responding to some invisible signal, Atlas suddenly stood, his body rigid with alert tension. His nose lifted to the wind, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, the first sound he'd made since Bob brought him home. In the distance, a dark sedan was parked across the street, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. It had been there for 2 days, but Bob hadn't thought much of it until now. Atlas moved to the front of the porch, placing himself between Bob and the street, his training finally overriding his depression. Whatever was coming, the dog was ready to fight. Bob's hand instinctively moved to his hip, reaching for a service weapon he no longer carried. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than grief and loneliness. He felt the sharp clarity of danger and the protective instinct that had kept him alive through 30 years of police work. "Good boy," he whispered to Atlas. "Let's see what they want." The dark sedan had been parked across from Bob's house for 3 days before he noticed the pattern. It arrived at different times, sometimes morning, sometimes evening, but always with the same 2 occupants whose faces remained hidden behind tinted glass. Atlas had noticed immediately, his behavior shifting from depressed resignation to sharp alertness whenever the car appeared. Webb's revelation about the cartel changed everything. Bob found himself checking locks twice, keeping curtains drawn, and sleeping with his old service revolver within reach. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 3 years of wanting to die, he suddenly had every reason to live, and people who wanted him dead. "We need to call the FBI," Webb said during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "Get you both into protective custody." Bob scratched Atlas behind the ears, feeling the dog's muscles tense as another unfamiliar car drove slowly past the house. "And go where?" "Some safe house where they'll separate us. Atlas has lost enough." The bond between man and dog had deepened rapidly once Atlas realized Bob wasn't going anywhere. The trauma that had kept Atlas isolated began to crack, revealing glimpses of the magnificent animal he'd once been. He started coming inside at night, though he still positioned himself by the front door. He began eating with something approaching appetite, and occasionally his tail would give a tentative wag when Bob spoke to him. But it was Atlas's protective instincts that truly amazed Bob. The dog seemed to sense threats before they materialized, tensing when suspicious vehicles approached, positioning himself between Bob and strangers, exhibiting the hypervigilance that had made him such an effective police dog. Bob realized that Atlas wasn't just healing, he was returning to his true nature as a protector. The escalation began on a Tuesday morning when Bob found his mailbox destroyed, scattered letters and magazines littering his front yard. A crude message had been spray-painted on his garage door. "Send the dog back where he came from." Atlas sniffed the paint with professional interest, his body language suggesting he recognized something familiar about the scent. Webb arrived within an hour of Bob's phone call, his face grim. "This is getting out of hand. These people aren't playing games." "Neither am I," Bob replied, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. For the first time in years, he felt like the cop he used to be, rather than the broken old man he'd become. "Atlas and I didn't survive this long just to roll over now." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 30s with short blonde hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Bob of someone he couldn't quite place. She introduced herself as Special Agent Jennifer Morrison from the FBI's Pittsburgh field office. "Officer Mitchell, I understand you have Atlas." Bob nodded, studying her credentials carefully. "What's your interest in my dog?" "Atlas isn't just any K9, sir. He was the key witness in the DeLuca cartel investigation. His scent work identified explosives, drug caches, and evidence that led to 47 federal indictments. 3 years ago, when Detective Chen was killed, Atlas disappeared before he could testify in the final trials. The pieces clicked into place. Testify? Dogs don't testify." Agent Morrison smiled grimly. "In federal court, they do. Atlas's scent identifications are considered expert testimony. Without him, we lost our most important cases. 7 cartel members walked free, including Vincent DeLuca himself." Bob felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "So, they want him dead. They want him silenced." "Dead is just the most permanent option." Morrison glanced at Atlas, who was studying her with professional interest. "The good news is we've been tracking the surveillance team. We know who they are, and we're ready to move. What do you need from us?" "Your cooperation. We're going to use Atlas as bait to draw them out, then arrest the entire cell. But it means putting both of you at risk." Bob looked at Atlas, seeing something in the dog's eyes that he recognized from his own mirror during his police years, the look of someone who'd found purpose again. "What's the plan?" The operation was set for Friday evening. Bob would take Atlas for their usual walk around the neighborhood, following a predetermined route that would lead them past the community park where FBI agents would be positioned. The surveillance team would likely make their move in the wooded area behind the park, away from witnesses. Webb insisted on participating despite his retirement. "You were my partner, Bob. I'm not letting you face this alone." The 3 days of preparation were tense. Bob noticed Atlas becoming more alert, more focused, as if the dog sensed that something significant was approaching. The neighborhood watch, organized after Atlas's heroic rescue of Mrs. Henderson, provided additional eyes and ears. Even Crawford from Animal Control offered to help, ashamed of his earlier antagonism toward Atlas. Thursday night, Bob couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Atlas, looking up at the stars and thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been a lonely old man waiting to die. Now he was preparing to face armed killers alongside a dog who'd become his closest companion. "You know, boy, Helen used to say that God never gives you more than you can handle. I used to think that was bullshit, especially after she got sick." Atlas shifted closer, resting his head on Bob's knee. But maybe she was right. Maybe I needed to lose everything before I could find what really mattered. Friday evening arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of autumn chill that made Bob's arthritis ache. He clipped the leash to Atlas's collar, more for show than necessity since the dog never strayed from his side, and they began their walk. Agent Morrison's voice crackled softly through the nearly invisible earpiece Bob wore. Subjects are mobile, black sedan following at approximately 1 block distance. Bob kept his pace casual, stopping occasionally to let Atlas investigate interesting scents. To any observer, they looked like an elderly man and his dog enjoying an evening constitutional. But Bob could feel the tension in Atlas's muscles, the coiled readiness of a predator preparing to strike. They reached the park as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Bob led Atlas toward the wooded path, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Behind them, car doors slammed quietly. "3 subjects approaching on foot," Morrison's voice reported. "We have visual confirmation, weapons visible." Atlas's ears pricked forward, and Bob felt the dog's body tense. They were no longer alone on the path. "Hold steady," Morrison whispered. "Let them get closer." The attack came suddenly. 2 men emerged from the trees ahead of them, while a third approached from behind. All 3 carried weapons. Not guns, but tranquilizer equipment. They wanted Atlas alive, Bob realized. Dead dogs couldn't be tortured for information about their federal testimony. "Easy, old man," the lead attacker called out in accented English. "Just hand over the dog and walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt." Bob's response was to drop the leash and step aside. "Atlas, protect!" The transformation was instantaneous. 3 years of depression and trauma fell away as Atlas became what he'd been trained to be, a weapon with 4 legs and a brilliant tactical mind. He moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, covering the distance to the first attacker in 3 powerful bounds. The man with the tranquilizer gun never had a chance. Atlas hit him low and hard, 75 pounds of muscle and determination sending him sprawling. The weapon flew from his hands, disappearing into the underbrush. The second attacker tried to circle around, but Atlas was already moving, his police training taking over. He feinted left, then darted right, his jaws clamping down on the man's wrist with controlled force, enough to disable, not to maim. The third man, seeing his companions neutralized, raised his hands in surrender just as FBI agents emerged from concealment. Agent Morrison appeared at Bob's side, weapon drawn and professional. "Vincent DeLuca sends his regards," the lead attacker spat as agents secured him with zip ties. "This isn't over." Morrison smiled coldly. "For you it is. You just attempted to assault a federal witness and a retired police officer. That's 20 to life in federal prison." As the attackers were led away, Bob knelt beside Atlas, running his hands over the dog's body to check for injuries. Atlas was breathing hard, but unharmed, his tail wagging for the first time since Bob had known him. The dog looked proud, purposeful, like himself again. Webb approached, shaking his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like that." He moved like he was 20 years younger. Bob smiled, scratching Atlas behind the ears. "He just remembered who he is." Agent Morrison joined them, holstering her weapon. "With these arrests and Atlas's continued cooperation, we can finally close the DeLuca case. There's a substantial reward involved, $50,000 for information leading to the arrest of cartel members." $50,000. Bob's mind reeled at the number. It was more money than he'd seen in years, enough to pay off his mortgage, maybe even afford proper medical care for Helen. He pushed the thought away. Helen was dead. She'd been dead for 3 years. The money would give him and Atlas a secure future, but it couldn't bring back what he'd lost. "There's one more thing," Morrison said quietly. "The dog's testimony in federal court. We'll need him for several weeks, possibly months." Bob looked at Atlas, who was still pressed against his leg, alert and protective. "We'll be there. Both of us." As they walked home through the gathering darkness, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a drowning man, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his purpose again. Atlas trotted beside him with his head high, no longer the broken animal Bob had found in Kennel 47. They were both different now, scarred but not defeated, older but not finished. "You know what, boy?" Bob said softly, as they turned onto their street. "I think we're going to be just fine." The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, jolting Bob from the deepest sleep he'd had in months. Atlas raised his head from his position by the bedroom door, ears alert to the shrill sound that had never brought good news at such an hour. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from Sunset Manor Memory Care. I'm calling about your wife, Helen." Bob's blood turned to ice. His wife. The lie he'd told everyone for 3 years, that Helen had died of cancer, suddenly felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. He'd never told anyone the truth. That Helen was alive but lost to Alzheimer's. That he'd spent every penny of their savings on her care. That he'd finally been forced to place her in a facility when he could no longer afford private nursing. "I don't understand," Bob whispered, his voice cracking. "My wife is—" "Mr. Mitchell, your wife has been asking for you. For the first time in 18 months, she's having what we call a lucid moment. She's asking for Bob and something about a dog named Max." The room spun around Bob as he struggled to process this information. Helen, remembering, Helen asking for him. Helen, who didn't even know her own name most days, somehow calling out across the fog of dementia to reach him. "I'll be right there," he managed to say. "Sir, visiting hours don't start until—" "I'll be right there." Bob dressed with shaking hands while Atlas watched with growing concern. The dog had learned to read Bob's emotional states with uncanny accuracy, and whatever was happening now was unlike anything Atlas had witnessed before. "Come on, boy," Bob said, clipping the leash to Atlas's collar. "There's someone I need you to meet." The drive to Sunset Manor took 45 minutes through empty streets, slick with November frost. Bob's mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if Helen's lucidity was temporary? What if she didn't recognize him? What if seeing him caused her more confusion and pain? And how could he possibly explain 3 years of lies to the woman he'd promised to love and protect? Atlas sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally placing a paw on Bob's arm when the old man's breathing became too rapid. The dog seemed to understand that this journey was different, more important than their usual drives around town. Sunset Manor stood like a fortress against the night, its warm windows the only sign of life in the surrounding darkness. Dr. Williams met them in the lobby, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who looked like she'd seen too many late-night emergencies. "She's been awake for 3 hours, Dr. Williams explained as they walked down the long corridor. "Asking for Bob, asking about a dog, asking why no one visits anymore. We tried to explain that we thought that I was dead?" Bob's voice was bitter. "No, doctor. I let everyone believe Helen was dead because I was too ashamed to admit I couldn't take care of her anymore." Dr. Williams stopped walking, her face registering understanding and compassion. "Mr. Mitchell, Alzheimer's isn't a failure of love. It's a disease. You couldn't have prevented it or cured it. I could have visited. I could have been here. Why weren't you?" Bob's throat tightened. "Because watching her forget me was killing me. Because she would get agitated when I came, confused about who I was. The doctors said it might be better if I stayed away, let her settle into her new routine, so I did. I stayed away and told everyone she was dead because it was easier than explaining why I abandoned her. They reached room 247, and Dr. Williams paused with her hand on the door. "Mr. Mitchell, your wife hasn't forgotten you. Not completely. In her lucid moments, you're still the first person she asks for." Bob entered the room with Atlas at his side, his heart breaking at the sight of the woman he'd loved for 45 years. Helen had aged dramatically since he'd last seen her 18 months ago. Her hair, once a beautiful silver, was now completely white and thin. Her face had the fragile quality of fine china, and her body looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. But her eyes were Helen's eyes, bright and alert and fixed on his face with recognition that made his knees buckle. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Where have you been? I've been waiting for you." Bob collapsed into the chair beside her bed, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Helen. I'm so sorry I stayed away. I thought—" "I know what you thought," Helen interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You thought I didn't know you anymore. But I do, Bobby. In here." She tapped her chest over her heart. "I might not remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember loving you. I remember our wedding day. I remember dancing in the kitchen to Frank Sinatra while the pot roast burned." Atlas approached the bed slowly, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment. Helen's eyes widened as she saw him. "Max?" she said uncertainly. "Bobby? You brought Max?" Bob's heart clenched. Max had been dead for over 30 years. But in Helen's mind, time had collapsed into fragments of memory that didn't always align with reality. "This is Atlas," Bob said gently, guiding the dog closer to the bed. "He's our dog now." Helen reached out with trembling fingers to touch Atlas's head. The dog remained perfectly still, somehow understanding the delicacy of the moment. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "I always wanted us to have a dog after you retired." "I know. I should have listened to you sooner." Helen's lucid gaze fixed on Bob's face. "Tell me the truth, Bobby. How long have I been here?" "How long since you visited?" Bob couldn't lie to her, not anymore. 18 months. I put you here 3 years ago when I couldn't afford the private nurses anymore. I've been telling people you died because I was ashamed." Instead of anger, Helen's face showed only sadness. "Oh, Bobby, you've been carrying this guilt all alone. I failed you. I promised to take care of you in sickness and health, and I—" "You did take care of me," Helen interrupted firmly. "You sold everything we owned to pay for my care. You bankrupted yourself trying to keep me comfortable. You made the hardest decision a man can make because you loved me enough to put my needs before your own pride." Bob sobbed openly now, months of suppressed grief pouring out of him. Atlas pressed closer to the bed, instinctively offering comfort to both humans. Helen's hand found Bob's, her grip surprisingly strong. "I need you to know something. The Helen you married, the woman who loved you for 45 years, she's still here. The disease might take my memories, might make me confused and frightened, but it can't take away the love. That's bigger than any disease." They talked for 2 hours before Helen's exhaustion began to show. Dr. Williams had allowed them privacy, understanding that this might be the last meaningful conversation Bob and Helen would ever have. As Helen's eyelids grew heavy, she looked at Atlas one more time. "Take care of him," she told the dog seriously. "He needs someone to love him, and he's got so much love to give in return." As if responding to her words, Atlas gently rested his chin on the edge of Helen's bed. She smiled, her fingers stroking his fur. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice fading. "I remember asking you to get a dog. I knew. I knew you'd need someone when I couldn't be there anymore." Bob watched his wife drift back into the fog of dementia, her hand gradually relaxing its grip on his. But for those 2 precious hours, she had been entirely herself, the woman who'd shaped his life, who'd loved him through his darkest moments, who'd somehow found a way to give him permission to move forward. Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway. "How is she?" "She's at peace," Bob said quietly. "And so am I." As they prepared to leave, Bob made arrangements to visit regularly, to be present in whatever way Helen could accept. The lies were over, the shame was gone, and in its place was something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. Atlas walked beside him to the parking lot, the dog's presence a steady comfort in the emotional aftermath of the reunion. Bob looked back at the lit windows of Sunset Manor, where his wife lay sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. "She's right, you know," Bob said to Atlas as they drove home through the pre-dawn darkness. "We both need someone to love us, and we both have so much love to give." For the first time in 3 years, Bob Mitchell felt like a whole man again. The federal courthouse in Pittsburgh loomed like a gray monument to justice as Bob and Atlas climbed the steps for what Agent Morrison had promised would be their final testimony. 3 months of court appearances had established a routine. Bob wore his best suit, Atlas wore his official canine vest, and together they presented evidence that would finally put Vincent DeLuca and his remaining associates behind bars for life. But today felt different. Atlas was more restless than usual, his nose working overtime as they passed through the metal detectors. The dog's unease set Bob on edge, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The cartel members they'd helped capture were all in custody, their surveillance teams neutralized. What could possibly go wrong now? The courtroom was packed with federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and media representatives covering what had become known as the Hero Dog trial. Bob took his usual seat in the witness section while Atlas positioned himself nearby, alert and professional. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the session to order, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the federal bench. "The court will hear final testimony regarding the scent evidence provided by Officer Atlas," Judge Hawkins announced. "Agent Morrison, please proceed." Agent Morrison stood, her confidence evident as she approached the witness stand. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of years of investigation that would finally bring down one of the most dangerous drug cartels on the East Coast. "Your Honor, Officer Atlas's scent identification directly linked Vincent DeLuca to explosive devices found at 3 separate crime scenes. The dog's testimony, combined with forensic evidence, establishes beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. DeLuca orchestrated the synagogue bombing that claimed Detective Sarah Chen's life." Bob felt a familiar pang at the mention of Atlas's fallen handler. The dog's ears flicked at the name, a subtle acknowledgement of the woman who'd been his partner, his purpose, his world, before everything fell apart. Defense attorney Richard Castellano rose from his table, his expensive suit and predatory smile radiating the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of getting guilty men acquitted on technicalities. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is asking this court to accept the testimony of an animal suffering from documented PTSD. How can we trust the reliability of a traumatized dog?" Judge Hawkins looked thoughtful. "Agent Morrison, please address the defense's concern about the witness's psychological state." Bob's chest tightened. This was the attack they'd been expecting, the one weak point in their otherwise ironclad case. Atlas's PTSD was well documented, his breakdown after Detective Chen's death a matter of public record. If the defense could convince the jury that Atlas was unreliable— "Your Honor," Morrison replied smoothly, "Officer Atlas underwent extensive psychological evaluation by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the foremost expert in canine PTSD. Dr. Martinez concluded that while Atlas shows signs of trauma, his scent detection abilities remain completely intact. In fact, his recent performance has been exemplary. Dr. Martinez took the stand, her credentials impressive even by federal court standards. She'd worked with military dogs returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, police K-9s injured in the line of duty, and search and rescue dogs traumatized by disaster scenes. Her testimony was methodical and devastating to the defense's case. Officer Atlas's nose work is actually enhanced by his heightened vigilance, Dr. Martinez explained. Trauma has made him more focused, more determined to complete his mission. His scent identifications during this investigation have been 100% accurate across 47 separate incidents. But Castellano wasn't finished. He approached the witness stand with the calculated movements of a shark sensing blood in the water. Dr. Martinez, isn't it true that traumatized dogs can become unpredictably aggressive? That Officer Atlas has a documented history of attacking children? Bob's blood ran cold. Webb's lie about his son, Jamie, was about to be used as a weapon against Atlas. He started to rise from his seat, but Atlas's sudden movement stopped him. The dog was standing now, his body rigid with alert tension. Something was wrong. Webb, who'd been sitting in the gallery, suddenly stood and walked toward the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I need to address that allegation." Judge Hawkins frowned. "Detective Webb, you're not scheduled to testify today." "I lied," Webb said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I lied about Atlas attacking my son. I've been lying for 3 years, and I can't do it anymore." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Castellano's confident expression faltered as his key piece of impeachment evidence crumbled before his eyes. Bob felt a mixture of relief and vindication wash over him. "Your Honor," Webb continued, "my son Jamie was injured during a drug bust, caught in crossfire between suspects and police officers. I blamed Atlas because it was easier than admitting I'd failed to protect my own child. Atlas never attacked anyone. He's never shown unprovoked aggression. I destroyed this dog's reputation to protect my own pride." Judge Hawkins called for order as the defense team scrambled to adjust their strategy. But the damage was done. Webb's confession had just eliminated their primary argument against Atlas's reliability. That's when Bob noticed Atlas's behavior becoming increasingly agitated. The dog was no longer sitting calmly. He was moving restlessly, his nose working frantically as if he'd detected something important. Bob had seen this behavior before. Atlas had found something. "Atlas, what is it?" Bob whispered. The dog looked at him with urgent intelligence, then began moving toward the back of the courtroom with purposeful strides. Bob followed, trusting Atlas's instincts over courtroom protocol. Other spectators turned to watch as the legendary police dog made his way through the gallery, his nose leading him toward something only he could detect. Atlas stopped beside a man in the back row, a man Bob hadn't noticed before. Middle-aged, wearing a maintenance uniform, he looked like any of the dozens of court employees who moved through the building daily, but Atlas's reaction suggested otherwise. And the dog sat and alerted, the same behavior he'd been trained to exhibit when he detected explosives. Bob's law enforcement instincts kicked in. "Security!" he shouted. "Bomb dog alert!" The courtroom exploded into chaos. Bailiffs rushed toward the back row while federal marshals began evacuating spectators. The man in the maintenance uniform tried to run, but Atlas was faster. The dog moved with the same fluid precision Bob had witnessed during the cartel attack, bringing down the suspect with controlled force. As security officers searched the man, they found what Atlas had detected: a sophisticated explosive device hidden in a maintenance bag, powerful enough to level half the courthouse. The bomb squad later determined it had been set to detonate during the lunch recess when the jury would be deliberating DeLuca's fate. Agent Morrison's face was pale as she approached Bob and Atlas in the aftermath. How did he know? The device was completely concealed, no obvious scent signature. Bob scratched Atlas behind the ears, marveling at the dog's incredible abilities. He wasn't just a bomb detection dog, he was the best bomb detection dog. 3 years of retirement doesn't erase 30 years of training. The bomber, identified as Marco Santoni, was a DeLuca family associate who'd managed to evade capture during the initial arrests. Under interrogation, he revealed the bomb plot had been DeLuca's final desperate attempt to derail his prosecution. If he couldn't intimidate witnesses, he'd eliminate them entirely. Judge Hawkins reconvened court that afternoon, her voice heavy with emotion. Today, this court witnessed something extraordinary. Officer Atlas didn't just provide testimony. He saved lives. His actions demonstrate not only his reliability as a witness, but his continued dedication to protecting innocent people. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Vincent DeLuca was convicted on all counts: conspiracy, drug trafficking, murder, and attempted murder. The sentence was life without parole. As they left the courthouse, Bob reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken old man contemplating ending his loneliness permanently. Now he was walking beside a hero dog who'd just prevented a massacre, heading home to a life that finally had meaning again. Atlas trotted beside him with visible pride, his head high and his tail wagging. The trauma that had defined him for 3 years was finally giving way to renewed purpose. He was a police dog again, a protector, a guardian of the innocent. "You know what, boy?" Bob said as they reached his truck. "I think we make a pretty good team." Atlas's response was to lean against Bob's leg, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke louder than words. They were both different now, scarred but not broken, aged but not defeated. The real work was just beginning. 2 years later, Bob Mitchell stood in the backyard of his modest home, watching Atlas demonstrate proper scent detection techniques to a group of young police recruits. The German Shepherd moved with the confidence of a master craftsman, his movements precise and purposeful as he located hidden training materials with the same skill that had made him legendary. The $50,000 reward from the DeLuca conviction had transformed Bob's life in ways he'd never imagined. The mortgage was paid off, his truck ran smoothly, and most importantly, he could afford regular visits to Sunset Manor without choosing between Helen's care and his own basic needs. But the real transformation went deeper than money. It was written in the way Bob carried himself, the purposefulness in his daily routine, the quiet contentment that had replaced years of desperate loneliness. Atlas has trained 47 new K9 teams in the past 18 months, Bob explained to the documentary crew filming their story. Dogs that might have washed out of traditional programs are thriving under his guidance. Turns out trauma can be a teacher if you let it. The second chances. K9 program had become Bob's full-time passion. Working with police departments across 3 states, he and Atlas identified dogs that had been written off as too damaged, too old, or too difficult, then proved everyone wrong. Their success rate was unprecedented. 93% of their trainees went on to successful careers in law enforcement, search and rescue, or therapy work. Helen's good days came irregularly now, sometimes weeks apart, but Bob treasured each one. Yesterday had been one of those days, and she'd asked about the beautiful dog she'd met months earlier. Atlas had spent an hour beside her bed, patiently accepting her gentle touches while she told him stories about the German Shepherd she'd owned as a child. "He remembers her," Bob told Dr. Williams during their regular consultation. "Every time we visit, he goes straight to her room. Even when she doesn't recognize me, she knows him." The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in spring. Agent Morrison's voice carried an excitement Bob hadn't heard since the courthouse bombing incident. "Bob, I have news. About Detective Chen. Bob's grip tightened on the receiver. What about her? She's alive. The words hit Bob like a physical blow. Sarah Chen, Atlas's handler, the woman whose death had broken the dog's spirit, alive. That's impossible. I saw the reports. The funeral was staged. We had to fake her death to protect her from cartel retaliation. She's been in witness protection for 4 years, but with DeLuca and his organization completely dismantled, she can finally come home. Bob looked at Atlas, who was sprawled in a patch of sunlight on the kitchen floor. How do you tell a dog that the person he'd mourned for 4 years was actually alive? How do you prepare for a reunion that might heal old wounds or tear open new ones? Detective Sarah Chen arrived the following Friday, her approach to Bob's house cautious and uncertain. She was smaller than Bob had expected, her dark hair now shoulder-length, her face marked by the strain of years in hiding. But when Atlas saw her through the front window, his reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The dog's entire body went rigid with disbelief. He whined once, a sound Bob had never heard from him. Pure emotion distilled into a single note of longing. Then Atlas was moving, his paws scrabbling against the hardwood floor as he raced to the door. Bob opened it to find Sarah Chen on his porch, tears streaming down her face as 75 pounds of German Shepherd launched himself into her arms. Atlas's composure completely shattered as he pressed against his former handler, his whole body trembling with joy and relief. "I'm sorry," Sarah sobbed into Atlas's fur. "I'm so sorry I left you. I thought I was dead. I thought you'd moved on." Bob watched the reunion with his own eyes burning. This was what Atlas had been waiting for all along, not just purpose or respect or even love, but the return of the person who'd meant everything to him. The dog's tail wagged so hard his entire back end moved with it, and the sounds he made were pure happiness given voice. "He never stopped looking for you," Bob said quietly. "Every siren, every uniform, every female voice, he'd search the crowd hoping it was you." Sarah looked up at Bob with gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you for taking care of him. For giving him a home when no one else would." "He saved me," Bob replied simply. "I was the one who needed rescuing." As the sun set over Millbrook, 3 figures sat on Bob's front porch: an old man who'd found his purpose, a young woman who'd come home from the dead, and a dog who'd learned that love could survive even the deepest wounds. Atlas lay between them, his head resting on Sarah's lap while Bob's weathered hand scratched behind his ears. They were all different now than they'd been 4 years ago. Scarred, certainly. Changed, absolutely. But also something more important. They were family, chosen and cherished and complete. In the distance, Mrs. Henderson was watering her garden, probably planning to bring them cookies later. The neighborhood children would ride their bikes past the house, waving at the famous dog who'd become their protector. And somewhere across town, Helen Mitchell would sleep peacefully, knowing that her husband had finally found what she'd always known he needed: someone to love and someone to love him in return. The story that had begun in Kennel 47 with a rejected dog and a brass collar had become something bigger than either of them could have imagined. It had become proof that sometimes the family you need finds you when you're not even looking, and that love, real, unconditional, transformative love, never really dies. It just waits for the right moment to come home. At 68, Bob Mitchell thought his story was over. Living on 1,147 a month, eating dinner alone, talking to photographs of his late wife Helen. Sound familiar? Like so many of us approaching or living in retirement, Bob had resigned himself to quiet desperation, believing his best years were behind him. Then, a rejected German Shepherd named Atlas changed everything. This wasn't just about a man saving a dog, it was about discovering that purpose, love, and meaning don't have expiration dates. Bob found that his greatest chapter began when he thought the book was closed. At an age when society tells us to step aside, Bob built a new life training rescue dogs, reconnected with his wife who wasn't actually dead but living with Alzheimer's, and proved that 68 isn't the end, it's a new beginning. His story reminds us that loneliness isn't permanent, that our accumulated wisdom and experience are assets, not liabilities, and that sometimes the family we need finds us when we're not even looking. Whether you're 55 or 75, whether you're facing retirement, loss, or just feeling invisible, your atlas is out there waiting. Your next chapter is calling. What moment in your life felt like an ending but turned out to be a beginning? Have you ever found unexpected purpose or love when you thought it was too late? Share your story below. We need to hear it.